The room went silent when the glass of red wine hit. Elvis Presley's white suit. 199 wealthy guests stared. Businessman named Richard Whitmore stood there, laughing as wine dripped from Elvis's collar onto the polished marble floor. Maybe now you'll learn your place, Richard said. Elvis slowly looked down at his ruined suit. Then he looked up and smiled. What nobody in that ballroom knew was that Elvis wasn't just another celebrity invited to the glamorous dinner. He was the one person who could make their billion-dollar deal disappear with a single signature. And the funniest part? Elvis wasn't angry. Not yet. He was curious to see just how far they were willing to go. The ballroom at the Grand Regency Hotel looked like somebody had emptied a billionaire's jewelry box onto the walls. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Waiters moved between tables carrying champagne, expensive appetizers, and tiny desserts that required more pronunciation than eating. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore, the chairman of Whitmore International, a company preparing to finalize a massive entertainment investment. The number being discussed that evening was almost impossible to comprehend. $1 billion. Richard loved saying the number. He said it whenever someone complimented the event. $1 billion deal. He would whisper proudly. Then he would smile as though he personally invented money. His executives surrounded him like a flock of extremely expensive pigeons. Across the room, Elvis Presley entered quietly. He wasn't wearing anything outrageous, just a dark suit, a simple shirt, and that unmistakable Elvis confidence. Several guests recognized him immediately. Others pretended not to. Richard noticed him too, but instead of welcoming Elvis, he whispered to his assistant, "Why is he here?" The assistant hesitated. He was invited. By whom? The assistant looked at the guest list. There was a pause. "Mr. Presley is listed as a principal investor." Richard laughed. "A principal investor?" The assistant nodded. Richard looked across the room again. Elvis was talking to an elderly waiter who had accidentally dropped a tray. Rather than complain, Elvis helped him pick everything up. Richard rolled his eyes. Some celebrities really believe fame makes them businessmen. He didn't know how wrong he was. Months earlier, Elvis had quietly purchased a controlling interest in a private holding company that owned the rights to a crucial part of Whitmore's proposed entertainment expansion. He hadn't announced it. He hadn't bragged about it. And most importantly, Richard hadn't bothered checking. That evening, Elvis wasn't there to steal the spotlight. He was there to observe. And he was already noticing something strange. Every time Richard discussed the billion-dollar agreement, his lawyers looked nervous. Every time Elvis walked past them, they became even more nervous. One lawyer finally whispered to another, "Does Whitmore know?" "Know what?" "Who owns the rights?" The other lawyer glanced toward Elvis. "No." Then came the moment that changed everything. Richard raised his glass and called Elvis over. "Mr. Presley, come join us." Elvis walked toward the table. Richard smiled. "I've heard you're interested in our little business venture." Elvis smiled back. "Little?" The executives laughed. Richard didn't. "You know what I mean." "I do." Richard raised his glass. $2 billion opportunities." Elvis lifted his glass. "Two, knowing who actually owns them." Richard didn't understand the joke, but one lawyer did. His face suddenly went pale, and Elvis noticed. Dinner continued for another hour. The conversation became louder as the champagne disappeared. Richard's confidence increased with every glass. Elvis remained remarkably calm. He listened more than he spoke. That made Richard uncomfortable. People who talked too much were easy to control. People who listened were dangerous. Eventually, Richard decided to embarrass Elvis. He gathered several executives around him and said loudly, "You know, gentlemen, business is about knowing your level." Elvis looked over. Richard smiled. "Some people are entertainers. Some people are businessmen." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "And some people are both." A few guests laughed. Richard didn't. "I suppose you think wearing a fancy suit makes you a businessman." Elvis looked down at his clothes. "I thought the suit made me look handsome." The table erupted in laughter. Even one of Richard's lawyers couldn't help. Smiling, Richard's face tightened. "You've always been good at jokes." Elvis smiled. "It's cheaper than therapy." More laughter. Richard was losing control of the room. Then someone made the mistake that would become legendary. Richard's younger associate, a man named Stephen, picked up a glass of red wine. "Maybe Mr. Presley needs something stronger." He stepped toward Elvis. Someone whispered, "Don't." Stephen ignored him. He raised the glass and poured the entire thing over Elvis's white suit. The ballroom froze. Red wine ran down Elvis's jacket. A drop landed on his shoe. Someone gasped. Someone else covered their mouth. Richard stared at Elvis, waiting for an explosion. Instead, Elvis slowly wiped wine from his eyebrow. Then he looked at Stephen. "That's one way to make a fashion statement." A few nervous laughs escaped. Stephen laughed. Richard laughed louder. "I suppose the king doesn't like red wine." Elvis nodded. "I like it." Richard smirked. "Then what's the problem?" "The problem," Elvis said, "is that you poured it on the wrong king." The room became silent again. Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Elvis reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. He handed it to the nearest lawyer. "Ask him." The lawyer opened it. His expression changed immediately. Richard noticed. "What is it?" The lawyer swallowed. "Sir, what?" "This is the ownership agreement." Richard grabbed the document. He read the first page. Then the second. His smile disappeared. Elvis wasn't simply an invited celebrity. His holding company controlled the rights required for Richard's billion-dollar expansion. Without Elvis's approval, the deal could not close. Richard looked up. "You?" Elvis nodded. "Me." Stephen suddenly became very interested in the floor. Elvis glanced at the wine stain. "And technically, you just poured wine on the man who can stop your billion-dollar deal." Someone at the table whispered, "Oh, that's awkward." Elvis smiled. "Very." For the first time that evening, Richard Whitmore had nothing to say. This was unusual. His lawyers were whispering rapidly. Executives were checking their phones. Someone at the far end of the ballroom had apparently already started texting the news to people outside. Elvis simply stood there with wine dripping from his sleeve. Richard finally spoke. "This must be some kind of misunderstanding." Elvis nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." Richard stared at him. "You're telling me you control the rights?" "No." Elvis paused. "I'm telling you my company controls them." Richard's face fell again. One of the lawyers interrupted. "He's correct." Richard turned sharply. "You knew about this?" "I tried to tell you." "When?" "3 times. And?" "You told me you were busy." Elvis laughed quietly. "That sounds expensive." The lawyer looked at the floor. "It could be." Richard stepped closer. "You can't simply block a billion-dollar transaction because someone spilled wine on you." Elvis shook his head. "I wouldn't do that." Richard exhaled in relief. Then Elvis added, I'd block it because your contract is terrible. The relief vanished. Elvis explained that his company had discovered several clauses giving Whitmore international disproportionate control over the new venture. The original agreement would have allowed Richard's company to acquire valuable rights while limiting the financial protection of smaller investors. Elvis had refused to approve it. He had been trying to negotiate better terms quietly, but Richard had never bothered listening. Instead, he had treated Elvis like a celebrity who wandered into a business meeting. That mistake was now costing him. Richard looked around the ballroom. We can discuss this privately. Elvis pointed toward his ruined suit. I think we've already made it pretty public. A guest nearby tried not to laugh. Not another guest whispered, This is better than television. Elvis heard him. That's good. Television usually has commercials. The room burst into laughter. Even several executives couldn't hold themselves back. Richard looked furious, and Elvis noticed Stephen standing behind him. The man who had poured the wine was visibly terrified. Elvis walked over. Stephen? Yes, sir? You have something to say? Stephen swallowed. I apologize. Elvis looked at his stained jacket. I accept. Stephen smiled with relief, and Elvis added, But you're buying me a new suit. Stephen nodded. Immediately. Absolutely. And dinner, of course, and dessert. Stephen nodded. Faster. Anything you want. Elvis smiled. Good. We're starting negotiations. The ballroom erupted again. The billionaire deal had suddenly become the world's most expensive dinner conversation. And Elvis hadn't even reached the punchline yet. The following morning, the newspapers were already buzzing about the strange dinner. But the real story wasn't the wine. It was the contract. Financial. Reporters discovered that Elvis's investment company held a controlling position in the rights connected to Whitmore's expansion. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what had happened. Richard's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Investors demanded answers. Lawyers demanded meetings. And Stephen? Stephen changed his phone number. Meanwhile, Elvis arrived at the emergency negotiation wearing a completely different suit. Stephen noticed immediately. New suit? Elvis smiled. Very expensive. Stephen looked nervous. I'll reimburse you. You'll reimburse me for the dry cleaning too. Stephen nodded. Of course. Elvis sat down. Richard entered the room looking exhausted. I want to apologize. Elvis gestured toward the chair. Sit. Richard sat. Elvis placed the original contract on the table. This isn't happening. Richard frowned. You're rejecting the deal? No. Elvis leaned back. I'm fixing it. That changed the entire atmosphere. Elvis proposed a new agreement. Smaller investors would receive stronger protections. Creative partners would receive better compensation. The rights would remain independently controlled. And Whitmore International would still receive a substantial share. Richard stared at the document. You've redesigned the entire deal. Elvis nodded. You wanted $1 billion company. I do. Then build one people actually want to invest in. Richard was silent. For once, he couldn't argue. The lawyers began reviewing the new proposal. After several hours, they reached an agreement. $1 billion deal survived, but it was no longer Richard's deal. Was a partnership, and Elvis had transformed a potential disaster into a better business arrangement. At the final signing, Richard approached him. I owe you an apology. Elvis smiled. You owe me a suit. Richard laughed. Yes, that too. Then Stephen appeared, carrying a large box. I brought something. Elvis opened it. Inside was an absurdly expensive white suit. The room applauded. Elvis held it up. Nice. Stephen smiled nervously. Can I ask you something? Sure. Are you going to tell everyone what happened? Elvis looked around. Why? Because I poured wine on you. Elvis smiled. Don't worry. Stephen relaxed. Then Elvis added, I'll probably tell everybody. Stephen's face dropped. The room exploded with laughter. Elvis walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around. Oh, Stephen? Yes. Next time you want to impress a billionaire. He pointed toward the wine glasses. Use a napkin. Years later, the story was still being told, not because Elvis had been humiliated, not because wine had ruined a white suit, and not even because $1 billion deal nearly collapsed over one ridiculous dinner. People remembered it because Elvis never responded the way anyone expected. He could have shouted. He could have embarrassed Richard publicly. He could have demanded revenge. Instead, he turned the entire situation into a lesson. In a joke. At a charity event years later, someone asked Elvis about the famous wine incident. Was it true? Elvis smiled. Absolutely. Were you angry? Not really. Why not? Elvis shrugged. I've had worse things spilled on me. The audience laughed. The interviewer asked, and what happened to the man who poured the wine? Elvis smiled. He learned an important lesson. What lesson? Never throw a drink at the man holding the contract. The audience roared, but there was another side to the story. Richard Whitmore's company eventually became significantly more successful. After the deal was restructured, the investors benefited. The creative partners benefited. And Richard himself became a much less arrogant businessman. Whenever someone asked him about the night, he would laugh and say, that was the most expensive glass of wine I ever poured. Stephen eventually became one of the executives responsible for managing the new partnership, and he never forgot the lesson. At company parties, whenever somebody reached for a glass near a celebrity, Stephen would immediately yell, put that down. Everyone knew why. The story became part of company folklore, but the funniest detail came from Elvis himself. Apparently, after the entire incident, he kept the stained white suit. He had it framed, not as a reminder of humiliation. As a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. A man can walk into a room looking like an entertainer and still understand business better than everyone wearing a three-piece suit. A quiet person can hold the most powerful position at the table. And sometimes, the person everyone underestimates is the person who has already read the contract. That night, nearly 200 guests thought they had witnessed Elvis being humiliated. They were wrong. They had witnessed a masterclass in patience, because while everyone else was laughing at the man covered in wine, Elvis was the only person in the room who knew exactly what happened next. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate the quiet person at the table, especially before you check who controls the deal. And if you were Elvis that night, what would you have done? Forgiven the wine incident or canceled the $1 billion deal? Drop your answer in the comments.